The auction tent was the kind of place that smelled like money, leather portfolios, and pressed linen, and the faint ghost of vintage bourbon. White lights strung overhead cast everything in a warm, flattering glow. The kind that made old things look precious and made powerful people look even more powerful. The Hargrove Classic Automobile Exhibition came to Crestfield every 2 years. And every time it did, the city's wealthiest residents dressed themselves up and drove their finest machines down to the waterfront pavilion to see and be seen. Gleaming Ferraris, restored Alfa Romeos, a pearl-white 1968 Shelby Cobra that drew gasps from 3 separate directions the moment it rolled off its trailer. This was not a place for the ordinary. Everyone in attendance understood that without being told. Victoria Hale arrived at 7 minutes past 6, which was 7 minutes later than she had planned, and 32 minutes earlier than everyone else considered fashionable. She did not care what was fashionable. She cared about control. At 34 years old, she was the youngest chief executive in the history of Hale Automotive Solutions, a company she had rebuilt from the wreckage of her father's failures and turned into one of the most valuable electric vehicle firms on the Semmelus, Eastern Seaboard. Her photograph had appeared on the covers of 4 national business magazines in the past 18 months. She had been called ruthless by her competitors, visionary by her board, and terrifying by everyone who had ever sat across a negotiating table from her. She wore a charcoal blazer with nothing underneath it, and carried nothing in her hands. Her assistant walked 3 steps behind her, holding everything else. Victoria did not browse the vehicles the way the other guests did, slowly, reverently, running fingers along chrome bumpers and bending to peer at engine bays. She moved through the exhibition like a woman conducting an inspection, her eyes flat and precise, her expression withholding approval as a matter of principle. She had already decided that the evening held little of genuine interest for her. Electric was the future. Gasoline was a eulogy. Events like these were useful for networking, and networking was the only reason she had come. She was midway through a conversation with a real estate developer whose name she had already forgotten when she heard the sound. It came from outside the tent, a low, irregular rumble. The kind of engine noise that sounded less like power and more like argument, like something old being asked to do something it wasn't entirely sure it could still manage. Several heads turned. A few people smiled. The way people smile when something embarrassing is about to happen, and they are grateful it is not happening to them. And then the 1967 Ford Mustang rolled into the exhibition grounds, and the laughter started before it had even come to a complete stop. The car was a ruin. That was the only honest word for it. The paint, once, presumably, a deep navy blue, had oxidized and peeled in long curling strips, leaving patches of bare metal that had gone the color of old pengs. The front bumper sat slightly crooked, held in place on the left side by what appeared to be a length of wire. The passenger window was covered with a piece of clear plastic sheeting, taped along 3 of its 4 edges. The rear left tire had a visible, slow lean to it, and the exhaust pipe coughed twice before the engine cut out, sending a small cloud of pale smoke drifting across the perfectly waxed hood of a neighboring Jaguar E-Type. The owner of the Jaguar pressed a handkerchief to his nose. Marcus Reed stepped out of the car and stood up straight. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had been stained dark at the knuckle lines from years of working with grease and metal. He was wearing clean, dark jeans and a button-down shirt that had been pressed with care. The kind of care that required effort rather than a domestic service. He was 38 years old, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not come from laughter. He looked at the crowd of people looking at him, and he did not look away. On the passenger side, the door opened more slowly, and his daughter climbed out. Lily was 9 years old, with her father's wide, serious eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. She was wearing a dress that had been ironed flat, and she was carrying a small notebook, because she always carried a small notebook, because Marcus had told her that people who paid attention to the world should write down what they noticed. The laughter in the crowd had not stopped. It had, if anything, grown more comfortable with itself. The way laughter does when it finds company. Victoria Hale was not laughing. She was doing something colder. She was looking at the Mustang the way a demolitions expert looks at a building, not with contempt exactly, but with the flat certainty that what she was seeing had no future. She crossed the distance between them without hurrying, because she never hurried, and she stopped a few feet from Marcus and looked at the car and then looked at him. "That," she said, loudly enough that the nearest 30 people heard it without straining, "belongs in a salvage yard." She paused for effect, the way a person pauses when they are accustomed to audiences, or possibly a landfill. "I'm not sure there's enough left to salvage." She looked at Marcus with the expression she kept for board members who brought her bad quarterly numbers. "You may have taken a wrong turn somewhere. This exhibition is for automobiles." The crowd rewarded her with laughter, real laughter, the kind that ripples outward and makes people feel they are part of something. Someone near the back said something that drew fresh amusement. A woman in a white dress leaned toward her companion and whispered. And they both smiled at the Mustang. The way one smiles at a joke that has already been told. Lily looked down at her notebook. Marcus watched his daughter look down. He put his hand on the Mustang's hood, flat-palmed. The way you put your hand on a person's shoulder. He did not raise his voice. He did not shift his weight. He looked at Victoria Hale with a steadiness that had nothing defensive in it. And when he spoke, it was quietly enough that the crowd had to lean in slightly to catch it. "Some things that look old," he said, "are worth more than they appear." Victoria smiled, not the warm kind. "Is that so?" It was not a question. "Tell me, do you think this thing will still be running in 30 days? She gestured at the Mustang with 2 fingers, dismissive. "I'll be generous." 30 days. Marcus looked at her for a moment. He looked at the crowd. He looked back at her. 30 days, he said. "You'll remember this car." He opened Lily's door, and they drove away. The exhaust gave one final cough at the exit, and the laughter followed them out into the street, like something thrown. The neighborhood where Marcus Reed lived had a name on city maps, Kellard District, but the people who lived there called it the Flatlands because the land was flat and because the name contained no promises about what else might be there. The houses were narrow and close together, built in the 1940s for factory workers, and never substantially updated. The streets were cracked in long, diagonal lines that the city repaired seasonally, and that cracked again before the next season arrived. Marcus and Lily lived in the second floor of a 2-family house on Brennan Street, in an apartment with 4 rooms and windows that let in drafts from October through April. The garage was 3 blocks away, a rented bay and a shared commercial space on Teller Avenue, behind a dry cleaner and beside a tire shop. The sign above the door read Reed Automotive in letters that had once been red. Marcus had painted the sign himself 8 years ago, when he had believed that the business would grow faster than it had. It had not grown. It had survived, which was a different thing. And survival had required everything he had. He worked 14 hours most days. He woke at 5:30 and made Lily's lunch before she was awake, leaving it in the refrigerator with a note on top, sometimes a drawing, sometimes a question for her to think about during the day. He dropped her at school by 7:15 and was in the garage by 7:30. He came home at 9 or 9:30, heated whatever he had left from the previous night's cooking, and sat with Lily for the half hour before her bedtime that they both treated as sacred. She told him about her day. He told her one true thing he had learned, or noticed. It was a practice her mother had started, and neither of them had been willing to let it go. Diana had died 3 years ago, a sudden cardiac event, the doctor had said, which Marcus had understood meant that the heart simply stopped, without warning, without ceremony, without the courtesy of a goodbye. She had been 35. Lily had been 6. The grief had arrived in Marcus like a structural failure, not a single crack, but a whole system giving way at once, quietly, invisibly, so that for weeks he had moved through his days without fully understanding that he was doing so. What had kept him functional was Lily, and what had kept Lily stable was his function, and so they had held each other upright through the worst of it the way 2 boards lean against each other to form an arch. The Mustang had been Marcus's father's car. Harold Reed had bought it new in 1967. Bought it the year he graduated from the engineering program at Carver Technical Institute. which in 1967 had taken a certain kind of determination to do. Harold had been a gifted engineer, the kind whose mind moved laterally through problems that stymied everyone around him, and he had loved the Mustang with the specific love of a man who had given it a meaning beyond transportation. He had driven it on his first date with Marcus's mother. He had driven Marcus home from the hospital. He had, in the last years of his life, spent more time under the hood of it than behind the wheel, tinkering, modifying, experimenting with ideas that no one around him had been able to fully follow. Harold Reed had died when Marcus was 22, and the Mustang had passed to Marcus, along with a box of notebooks and a set of rolled mechanical drawings that Marcus had packed into a storage unit and mostly not opened since. The car itself he had driven and neglected and occasionally worked on, keeping it barely functional the way you keep something alive when you can't afford to let it die but can't quite afford to save it either. He had told Lily once that the car was the last thing her grandfather had loved, and that seemed like reason enough to keep it. The night they came home from the exhibition, Lily sat on the apartment steps and held her notebook on her knees without opening it. Marcus sat beside her. They were quiet together for a while, the way they sometimes were, letting the city noise fill the space between them. Those people laughed at it, Lily said finally. Yes, Marcus said. They laughed at you. They laughed at what they thought they saw. He looked out at the street. A bus passed at the far end of the block, its lights warm and moving. That's different. Lily was quiet again. Then, why don't you sell it? We could use the money. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders. The question was fair. It had a fair answer, and also a true one. And they were not quite the same. Because your grandfather put something in that car, he said. Something important, and I'm not ready to let someone take it apart before I understand what it is. Lily looked at him the way she looked at things she was planning to think about for a long time. Okay, she said, and opened her notebook and started writing. 3 days after the exhibition, Victoria Hale was sitting in her glass-walled office on the 14th floor of the Hale Automotive Solutions building, reading a briefing on competitor activity in the solid-state battery market, when her communications director appeared in the doorway with an expression that indicated something required management. The video had spread. Not far yet, but far enough a clip. Shot on someone's phone. 30 seconds of Victoria's remarks to Marcus, in the exhibition tent, cut together with a slow pan of the Mustang, and then a shot of Lily looking down at her notebook. The clip had a certain quality to it. The kind that moved people not because it was dramatic, but because it was specific. A large man in a pressed shirt, standing beside a ruined car. Speaking quietly, a small girl looking at the ground, a woman in a charcoal blazer, walking away. Victoria watched the clip twice. She told her communications director to handle it, which was what she said when she didn't want to discuss something. She went back to the briefing, but she found, over the next 2 days, that she thought about the clip more than she intended to. Not with guilt. Guilt required a belief that you had done something wrong, and Victoria had not yet arrived at that conclusion. What she thought about was the man's face. The steadiness of it, the absence of anger in it. She had been in rooms with hundreds of powerful people, and she had learned to read the specific texture of a man's confidence, to distinguish performance from substance. Marcus Reed had looked at her with something that she recognized, uncomfortably, as the real kind. She told herself this was not relevant information. Her company's electric vehicle, the Hale Meridian, a sleek 240-mile range crossover that retailed starting at $62,000, was scheduled for its public launch in 30 days. The launch event had been in planning for 8 months. It was going to be the most significant public moment in the company's history, and Victoria intended it to function as a statement. This is what the future looks like. And everything that came before it is over. She had staked her professional reputation and a considerable portion of her company's market capitalization on that statement being received as truth. She did not think about Marcus Reed or his car again, or she tried not to. In the garage on Teller Avenue, Marcus had opened the box. He had known for years that it was there, the flat wooden crate his father's things had been shipped in after Harold died, sitting in the corner behind the rolling tool chest, under a tarpaulin that had stiffened and gone gray. He had not opened it because opening it had seemed like an ending, the last conversation with a man he was not ready to finish talking to. But something about the exhibition had changed his relationship to the waiting. He pulled the tarpaulin off and pried the crate open with a flat bar, and found the notebooks arranged in a careful row, 11 of them, their spines labeled in Harold's small, precise handwriting. Dates, mostly, and one phrase, repeated on the covers of the last 3 notebooks in the row, Project Catalyst. He brought them upstairs and read until 2 in the morning. Harold Reed had been working on something. That much was clear from the first notebook's opening pages. The language was technical in a way that Marcus, who had grown up listening to his father talk about engines the way other fathers talked about sports teams, could mostly follow. The idea was this. Harold believed that the fundamental approach to hybrid propulsion, the way internal combustion and electrical systems were made to communicate with each other, was being done backwards. The industry was forcing 2 different kinds of energy logic to cooperate through a translation layer that wasted 30 to 40% of potential efficiency. Harold's notebooks proposed a different architecture, not a translation layer, but a unified language, a thermal management and electrical coupling system that he had called, in his careful handwriting, the Reed convergence method. The mathematics took Marcus 3 nights to work through. He was not his father's equal as a theoretician, but he was his father's son, and he could read the equations the way you read a letter in a familiar handwriting, not just for the information, but for the person behind it. What his father had designed, as best Marcus could understand it, was a system capable of producing dramatically higher fuel efficiency than anything currently on the market, and doing so with components that were simpler, lighter, and cheaper than the competing technology. The last notebook contained a note dated the year before Harold died. It said, "Filed patent application, case number CR 44789, assigned counsel, Whitmore and Associates, will update." There was no update. There was just the Mustang, sitting in the bay below, which Harold had been using as his test platform. Marcus went down to the car and spent an hour with a flashlight, moving through it the way his father had taught him to move through engines slowly, respectfully, with the understanding that mechanical systems have a logic that rewards attention. Behind the firewall, beneath a sheet of noise insulation that had been glued and re-glued in a way that was clearly deliberate, he found a secondary enclosure. Inside the enclosure were 2 components he had never seen before, hand-machined, labeled in his father's handwriting, connected to the car's existing systems by wiring that had been run with meticulous care. Beside the components was a folded sheet of paper. Marcus unfolded it. It was a cover page from a legal document. At the top, in bold type, it read, "Notice of Patent Abandonment Reed. Harold J. Case CR 44789. Below that, a handwritten note in different handwriting, not Harold's. It said simply, "Better you don't fight this one." Marcus sat on the concrete floor of the bay and held the paper in his hands for a long time. He thought about his father, who had been the most methodical man he had ever known, and about the word abandonment, and about the gap between what a man chooses and what a man is made to accept. He thought about the last 3 years of his father's life, when Harold had withdrawn from almost all professional contact, had sold the house and moved to a small apartment, had said very little about the work that had once been the center of his world. Marcus had attributed it to age, to diminishment, to the quiet shrinking that sometimes happens to people as they get older. He understood now that it had been something else. It had been the specific silence of a man who has been told to shut up and has not yet found a way not to. He climbed out from under the car. He stood in the bay and looked at the Mustang, the peeling paint, the crooked bumper, the plastic sheeting over the window, and he saw it differently than he had before. He had always thought of it as his father's. He understood now that it was also his father's evidence. Marcus began working on the Mustang the following night. He worked with a system methodical, sequential, the way Harold had always insisted a proper mechanical project had to be approached. He made a list of everything the car needed to be what it had been designed to be, and then he ordered that list by what was structurally necessary first. New seals, a rebuilt carburetor. Bodywork, paint. The suspension required almost complete replacement. The interior seat foam, door panels, and headliner he sourced from a specialty supplier in Ohio, the same supplier his father had used, whose name appeared in the notebooks. Lily came to the garage on weekends and helped in the ways she could, wiping components clean before they went in, handing him tools when he was underneath the chassis, recording in her notebook the name of each part and where it came from and what it did. She asked questions without stopping, and Marcus answered all of them, even the ones that required him to stop what he was doing and think carefully about how to explain something in a way a 9-year-old could grasp. He found that explaining things to Lily made him understand them better himself. She had that effect. "What did Grandpa put in here?" she asked one evening, lying on her stomach on the concrete, peering under the car with a flashlight. "A better way of doing something that everyone else was doing wrong," Marcus said. From somewhere beneath the differential. Did he know it was better? He proved it was better. Lily was quiet for a moment. Then, "So why did he stop?" Marcus slid out from under the car and sat up and looked at his daughter. She was watching him with that patient, serious expression she got when she was asking a question she already half knew the answer to. "Because sometimes being right isn't enough," he said. "If the wrong people decide your right answer is inconvenient, they can make it go away." Lily wrote something in her notebook. Marcus went back under the car. The work was happening every night now from 9, after Lily was in bed, until 1 or 2 in the morning. He was running on 5 hours of sleep and enough coffee to be a reasonable health concern. His regular customers got the same quality of work they always had. He made sure of that. But every minute that wasn't already claimed by the business or his daughter belonged to the Mustang. He could feel the momentum of it now, the way a project starts to pull you forward when it develops its own gravity. He had not told anyone what he had found in the notebooks. He had not told anyone about the legal document. He had been quiet about all of it, because Harold had taught him that you don't announce a hand before you're ready to play it. 2 weeks in, a woman named Sandra Poole, a reporter from the Crestfield Courier, who had seen the clip and been curious enough to drive over to Teller Avenue, appeared at the garage door one evening and asked if she could talk to him. Marcus said she could talk while he worked. She asked what he was doing to the car. He told her he was restoring it. She asked why. He said because it was worth restoring. She asked if he had anything to say about what had happened at the exhibition. He looked up from the engine bay and said he had done his saying there. She wrote something down and left, and the article she published was small and local, but it had a quality of specificity that got passed around, and within a week the number of people paying attention to the story of Marcus and the Mustang had grown considerably. A letter arrived at the garage with no return address. Inside was a single page, printed, that read, "You don't know what you're getting into. Leave the car alone and leave the past alone. This is your only warning." Marcus read it twice. He set it on the workbench beside the harmonic balancer he was about to reinstall. He picked up his torque wrench and went back to work. On the 17th day, Victoria Hale learned that the patent filing existed. Her legal team had begun monitoring Marcus more carefully after the reporter's article, a precautionary measure that Victoria had authorized without discussing in detail, because the details were the kind she preferred to have known rather than stated. The researcher assigned to the task was thorough. She found the patent case number, filed it with the appropriate Federal Registry query service, and placed a printed summary on Victoria's desk on a Tuesday morning. Victoria read it standing. She did not sit because sitting would have indicated that this required sitting, and she was not ready to grant it that status. She read the summary twice. She called her chief legal counsel into her office, closed the door — she almost never closed the door — and told him to find out everything. What her legal team found over the following 48 hours was this. Harold Reed had filed a patent application for a hybrid propulsion architecture 22 years ago. The application had been reviewed by the United States Patent and Trademark Office and granted a provisional patent pending full examination. At that point, a licensing negotiation had begun between Harold Reed's assigned counsel and a technology acquisition firm called Pelham Group which had been acting as an intermediary for a consortium of automotive technology investors. The negotiation had been ongoing for 7 months when, abruptly, Harold Reed's attorneys had filed a notice of voluntary abandonment. 3 months after the abandonment was filed, Pelham Group had transferred a portfolio of proprietary technology assets, including materials consistent with Harold's specifications, to a company called Convergence Propulsion Systems. Convergence Propulsion Systems had been acquired 11 years ago by a larger firm. That larger firm had eventually been acquired by a company called Hale Drive Technologies, which had been the foundational technology holding that Victoria's father had used to build what was now Hale Automotive Solutions. Victoria stood at the window of her office for a long time. Below her, Crestfield went about its Tuesday, with the indifference of a city that doesn't yet know what's about to happen. She called her communications director and told her to prepare for a crisis. She called her head of investor relations and told him the same thing. She called her assistant and told him to find out how to reach Marcus Reed. Then she sat down and thought about what she actually knew versus what she could prove versus what Marcus Reed could prove, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that the man working in the garage on Teller Avenue was not just restoring a car. He was building a case. He had been building it for 17 days, and he had 13 days left, and she did not know what he planned to do with it when it was finished. She authorized an offer, $1.2 million for the Mustang, as is, immediate transfer. She told her assistant to make clear that the offer was extremely generous and that it came with a non-disclosure agreement as standard. The assistant called the garage number. Marcus picked up the phone, listened to the offer, and said, "Tell her no." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell her there are things you can't buy with money. Tell her I thought she would have learned that by now." He hung up. The assistant reported this back to Victoria. She said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then she said, "All right," in a voice her assistant had never heard her use before. And she went back to her desk and started reading. On the 21st night, someone broke into the garage. They had a key, or had made one, or had picked the lock well enough to leave no obvious marks. They did not take anything. What they did was open the hood of the Mustang and remove the custom components Harold had built, the 2 hand-machined units behind the firewall, the wiring harness that connected them to the car's main system. They also took the folder of documents that Marcus had been keeping in the top drawer of the filing cabinet beside the tool chest, which contained photocopies of the patent filing, the abandonment notice, and Harold's laboratory notebooks. They left the originals because they hadn't found the originals, because Marcus kept the originals in a lockbox in the apartment above the laundromat on Brennan Street where he had once lived, held by a neighbor he trusted and had told no one about. They also, either accidentally or intentionally, left a valve open near the fuel system. Marcus arrived at 6:30 in the morning to find the smell of fuel thicken the bay. The components were gone. The drawer was open, its contents scattered. There was a dark stain on the concrete near the car's front end where fuel had pooled. Another few hours and the combination of temperature, volatility, and the electrical system's proximity would have been a serious fire. He called Lily out of school, which he had never done before, and when she arrived and saw her father's face, she did not ask questions. She sat on the workbench and held her notebook on her knees and waited. Marcus walked the length of the garage slowly, cataloging what was missing and what remained. He did not make a sound. His face had gone very still. After a while, Lily said, "What do we do?" Marcus looked at the Mustang. The body was untouched. The engine was intact. They hadn't known what they were looking for inside the main engine bay, because what Harold had built was designed to be invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. The components they'd taken were significant. But Harold had machined 2 sets. The second set was in the same lockbox as the notebooks. "We keep going," Marcus said. He called Dominic Farrow, who worked 3 bays down and had been a diesel mechanic for 30 years, and who owed Marcus a significant favor from the winter when Marcus had covered his rent during a slow stretch. He called Jerome Webb, who had been Harold's student once, briefly, at the technical college, and who had never stopped being grateful for it. He called 2 other men whose names he had known since childhood, Men who worked with their hands and understood what it meant when something you'd built was deliberately taken from you. By 8 that evening, 6 people were working on the Mustang, and the word had moved through the flatlands the way word moves in close communities, not as announcement but as invitation. Arriving person by person, drawing more of them in until the bay was crowded and warm and lit by work lights, and the sound of the tools filled the space like a particular kind of music. Lily stayed. She walked the length of the garage and wrote down the name of every person who came, and what they did, and what time they arrived. She was going to remember this. She had decided. Around midnight, when the critical components had been reinstalled and tested again, she went to her father where he was crouching by the rear wheel well and held out her hand. In her palm was a small, heavy object. A chrome-handled box-end wrench, worn smooth at the grip from decades of use. Marcus looked at it. He knew it immediately. He had seen it in his father's hand 100 times. "I found it in the drawer," Lily said. "They must have missed it." Marcus took the wrench in both hands and held it for a moment. His jaw was tight. He did not say anything. He didn't need to. He went back to work. The morning of the 30th day arrived gray and cold, with a marine layer that had come in off the bay overnight and covered the city in a flat, low light that made everything look more serious than usual. Victoria Hale was in the back of her car at 6:45, reading final briefing notes on the Meridian launch event. The event was scheduled to begin at 11 that morning at Founders Plaza, the wide pedestrian square at the center of the city's commercial district, which the city had closed for the day at Hale Automotive Solutions' request and considerable expense. There would be a stage, a live band, 7 television cameras, and an expected attendance of several thousand people. The mayor had agreed to give opening remarks. 3 national technology journalists had been given exclusive pre-event access. It was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of morning that changes things. Victoria had not slept well. She had, in fact, slept poorly for 5 nights running, which was unusual for her. She was not a person who lost sleep over professional uncertainty. She had learned to separate herself from that particular form of anxiety early in her career, and had considered it one of her more useful adaptations. What was keeping her awake was not uncertainty. It was the specific quality of what Marcus Reed had said to her on the night of the exhibition. "Some things that look old are worth more than they appear." She kept returning to it the way you return to a phrase that you suspect contains more than its surface. She was not a superstitious woman, and she did not believe in premonitions. But she had built a career on reading rooms and reading people, and something in that room and that man had registered in a part of her that she did not fully understand. The event started on time. The stage filled with the kind of orchestrated energy that professional event planners produce: music, movement, the smooth escalation of anticipation that leads an audience to feel that they are about to witness something important. The mayor gave his remarks. The technology journalists photographed the Meridian, which was beautiful, genuinely beautiful. Its lines clean and confident, its surface, a deep mineral blue that shifted slightly in the gray morning light. Victoria took the stage at 11:20 and began her prepared speech. She was 3 minutes into it when the sound came from the street. It was low at first, easy to dismiss a rumble from somewhere outside the plaza, the kind of sound a city makes constantly and that residents learn to not hear. But this sound had a quality that was difficult to ignore. It had a rhythm and a depth that was not machine noise but was something more deliberate, more purposeful. Several people in the crowd turned. A camera operator swung around toward the street, and then Marcus Reed turned the corner onto the plaza at the wheel of the Mustang, and the plaza went very, very quiet. The car was extraordinary. There was no other word that fit. What had arrived at the exhibition 30 days ago as an embarrassment had become something that stopped people mid-sentence and held them. The bodywork was immaculate, panels pulled true, seams aligned, the metal worked to the kind of smooth precision that requires patience above all else. The paint was a deep, breathing blue-black that seemed to hold the light rather than reflect it, the kind of color that takes a skilled painter a long time to achieve. The chrome bumpers, door handles, trim, had been restored to a brightness that made it look like something new, pretending to be old, though it was the other way around. The tires were wide and black, and sat level on the pavement. The windows were clear. The exhaust note, as Marcus brought the car to a stop in the center of the plaza, was a low, even, commanding sound. A sound like authority, like something that has found its full capability and is not showing off, merely demonstrating. Marcus stepped out of the car. He was wearing dark clothing, nothing ceremonial, nothing performative. Lily was beside him. She was holding a folder. He walked to the edge of the stage. Victoria, still at the microphone, watched him come. She did not speak. The crowd did not speak. "My name is Marcus Reed," he said, without a microphone, to the plaza. His voice carried. 3 years ago, my father died. 30 days ago, I was told his life's work was junk." He paused. "I have something to show you." What happened over the following 90 minutes was the kind of thing that cities remember. Marcus had arranged through Sandra Poole and through a law professor at Crestfield University, who had been quietly advising him for 2 weeks, a structured public presentation. Lily distributed printed copies of the patent documentation. The law professor spoke to the timeline. A retired engineer who had known Harold Reed testified, briefly and specifically, to the nature and significance of what Harold had designed. Marcus then invited the 7 television cameras to document a live demonstration, the Mustang's modified engine, running through a standard efficiency protocol alongside the Meridian, both vehicles instrumented with publicly readable monitoring equipment that had been installed by a third-party testing firm the previous day. The numbers were not close. Harold Reed's modified hybrid architecture, running in a restored 1967 Mustang, with components that Marcus had machined by hand from his father's original specifications, achieved a fuel efficiency reading that exceeded the Meridian's reported figures by a margin that the journalists scrambled to verify and then verified again. The crowd watched in silence as the numbers appeared on a portable display screen that someone had brought on a wheeled cart. The silence was the particular silence of a large group of people reconsidering something they thought they understood. Victoria Hale stood on the stage throughout all of it. She did not leave. She stood with her hands at her sides and watched, and her face had gone through several different things before settling into something that was less composed than anything most of the people in the plaza had ever seen on it. She was a powerful woman who had spent years making sure that the rooms she entered were rooms she controlled, and she was now standing in a room she did not control, and what was happening in it was partly her fault, and she knew it. When the demonstration was over, and the crowd had erupted into the kind of noise that fills a city square when something genuinely unexpected has occurred, Marcus looked up at the stage. He did not say anything to Victoria. He didn't need to. Lily took his hand. He looked down at her. She was writing in her notebook. The investigation was opened by the Federal Trade Commission within 72 hours. The story was picked up by 4 national outlets before noon on the day of the plaza demonstration, and by international wire services within 24 hours of that. The patent documentation was entered into a public litigation database by Marcus's attorney, making it accessible to any party with an interest in the matter, which included several significant parties, among them 2 competing automotive firms that had their own questions about the Pelham Group's acquisition history. Hale Automotive Solutions stock declined significantly in the 3 days following the plaza. Victoria's board called an emergency session. The communications team, working from contingency plans that had been in preparation since Victoria had first authorized the offer to Marcus, released a statement saying that the company was cooperating fully with any investigation and that management took the integrity of its intellectual property provenance with the utmost seriousness. It was the kind of statement that sounds like it means something and means mostly that the lawyers are now in charge. Victoria resigned the CEO position 9 days after the plaza event. The announcement was terse and attributed the decision to a desire to allow leadership stability during a period of institutional review. She had written the statement herself, which her communications director could tell by the way it didn't quite sound like anyone. 2 weeks after the plaza, Marcus received a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. He picked up on the fifth ring. "I'd like to meet with you," the voice said. "Not with lawyers, not for cameras. Just a conversation." He recognized the voice. They met at a diner on the south side of the city neutral territory. Marcus had suggested on a morning when the marine layer had burned off and the light was clean and clear. Victoria arrived first, which surprised him. She was wearing jeans and a canvas jacket and no jewelry, and she looked, if not smaller than he expected, then differently proportioned, like a person whose scale had been partly a function of context, and who outside of that context was simply a person. She was holding a coffee. She did not look like she had slept much. Marcus sat across from her. They looked at each other for a moment. "I want you to know," Victoria said, "that I didn't know about your father, about the acquisition history. When I took over the company, the technology was already in our portfolio for years, and the file on how it got there was not something anyone had flagged." She wrapped both hands around her coffee. "I know that doesn't make it right." "No," Marcus said. "It doesn't. I also know," she said, "that nothing I say changes what happened to him." Marcus was quiet for a while. He looked out the diner window at the street, where an ordinary Tuesday was proceeding without interest in either of them. He thought about his father at the end, in the small apartment, with the notebook stacked on the desk and the careful, precise handwriting moving across the pages in the specific way it always moved, bearing witness to ideas that the world had been persuaded not to receive. He thought about Harold's hands, which had looked something like his own. "He wasn't a bitter man," Marcus said. "That's what I always found hard to understand. After everything, he wasn't bitter. He just kept working." He looked back at Victoria. He believed the work mattered more than who got credit for it. "He used to say that to me. I thought it was just something people said. Now I think he meant it the way you mean something that cost you a lot." Victoria was looking at him with an expression that was not quite what he had expected. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something more complicated, the look of a person who has encountered a set of facts that requires them to revise their understanding of how they got where they are. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "Open a school," he said. "A real one. For kids who want to learn how to work on things. Engines, systems, fabrication, the kind of skills nobody funds, because there's no margin in teaching poor kids useful things." He picked up his coffee. "And I'm going to keep the Mustang." Victoria nodded slowly. "That seems right." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, I'd like to fund it. The school. Anonymously, if you'll allow it." Marcus looked at her. He considered the offer for longer than was comfortable. "You can fund it," he said. "But not anonymously. If you're going to do the right thing, you should have to stand in it." Victoria looked at him for a long time. "Okay," she said. The Reed Technical Institute opened in the Flatlands, on a wide lot on Brennan Street that had been a parking facility, 6 months after the plaza. The building was simple and functional, and smelled like fresh concrete and machine oil, which Marcus considered appropriate. 22 students enrolled in the first cohort, young men and women from the Flatlands and neighboring districts, most of whom had been told in one way or another that the kind of knowledge they were seeking was not meant for them. Marcus taught most of the engine curriculum himself. Dominic Farrow taught diesel systems. Jerome Webb taught chassis fabrication. On Tuesdays, a retired electrician named Emmett Cross came in and ran the wiring labs. Lily enrolled in the first cohort. Marcus had not suggested it. She had decided on her own and told him as though it were settled. Which it was. She was 10 now, the youngest student in the program, and the most meticulous. She kept her notebook going, filling it with diagrams and measurements, and the occasional observation about what she noticed that others seemed to miss. The Mustang was donated to the city's history museum 6 months after that, with one condition. It was to be displayed in the permanent collection, not in storage, and it was to be displayed in the state it was in, not restored to showroom condition, but exactly as it had arrived in Founders Plaza on that gray morning, in the color Harold had chosen and Marcus had matched, with the engine accessible for viewing. The plaque beside it read, in letters that were not particularly large, "This vehicle was built by Harold Reed, completed by Marcus Reed, and returned to the public by Lily Reed," who wrote down everything she saw. Below the main text, in smaller type, was a single sentence. "Do not judge the value of a thing by the condition in which you first find it." The morning the museum opened its new display, Marcus and Lily went alone, before the doors opened to the public, and stood in front of the car in the quiet of the empty hall. The light came in through high windows and fell across the Mustang at an angle that made the blue-black paint look almost like water. Marcus put his hand on the hood, flat-palmed, the same way he always had, the same way his father had before him. Lily was writing in her notebook. He looked over at what she was writing and read, "The car doesn't run anymore, but it's still going." He looked at his daughter. She looked back at him with those wide, serious eyes that were her mother's and his own at the same time, and he thought about all the things that get passed from one person to another without anyone planning it. The stubbornness, the patience, the belief that what you make matters, the refusal to let the world's opinion of your work substitute for your own understanding of its worth. "Your grandfather," Marcus said, "would have liked you a lot." Lily considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "I know," she said. "I would have liked him too." They stayed in the hall until the museum staff arrived, and the doors opened, and the first visitors began to filter in and stop in front of the Mustang, the way people stop in front of things that ask them to reconsider something. Marcus stepped back and watched them look. He watched their faces go through the small, quiet recalibration that happens when you encounter something that refuses to be what you expected it to be. The strongest thing beneath the hood of that Mustang had never been the engine. Everyone who had stood in front of it long enough eventually understood that. The engine was remarkable. The engineering was a legacy that would take years to fully account for. But what the car carried, what it had always carried. From the first day Harold Reed drove it off the lot in 1967 to the morning, Marcus brought it into Founders Plaza was something that had no technical specification and no market value, and no weight that a scale could measure. It was the dignity of a man who built something true and refused to let the world make him believe it wasn't. It was the love of a father who kept something whole so his son could find it. It was the attention of a girl with a notebook who wrote down everything she saw. That was what the car was. That was what it had always been. And that, in the end, was what no one had been able to take from it, not the lawyers, not the acquisition agreements, not the laughter in an exhibition tent, not the deliberate hands that had reached into the engine bay in the dark. Marcus Reed drove home that evening in a borrowed truck, because the Mustang was no longer his to drive, and because some things are meant to be given. The road was quiet. The city moved past him the way cities do, indifferent and continuous, and full of people carrying things they haven't yet understood. He thought about his father. He thought about Diana. He thought about Lily writing in her notebook in the museum, her handwriting already beginning to look a little like his, a little like Harold's, the family script passing itself forward in the way that nothing, not time, not loss, not the cold calculations of people who believe that value is a function of price can fully interrupt. He pulled onto Brennan Street and parked and sat for a moment in the dark of the cab, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. Some things that look old, he thought, are worth more than they appear. He went inside.